Good evening. Tonight's top story.
I shouldn't be writing this. The instinct in me screams to stay silent, to let the memories rot in the back of my mind where they've stayed for years. But I can't anymore. Not with the way the world feels lately. Not with the ways music keeps following me, whispering lines that sound almost word for word like the ones I once wrote in a letter I should never have given to her. Her name was Celeste. She was my student. And if you've heard the name before, I wouldn't be surprised. It surfaces sometimes, buried in online rumors and whispered TikTok threads, an urban legend attached to tragedy. But I was there. I was part of it. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the way her pale face tilted toward me as I pressed that envelope into her hand. It was supposed to be harmless. Words scratched out in late-night exhaustion, an attempt to help a lost girl find some clarity. I never expected those words to fester, to grow into something so vile, so unstoppable, that I've spent every day since regretting them. This isn't easy to say, but I was young then. Too young to be standing at the front of a classroom, trying to carry authority I didn't truly have. 24, still figuring out who I was. And yet, when Celeste walked into my class that fall, something about her unsettled me from the very beginning. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was hard to ignore. Then to the point of fragility, skin so pale it seemed translucent beneath the fluorescent lights. Her black hair hung in limp strands, as if it had never known the warmth of sunlight. But it was her eyes, those eyes. Wide, glassy, like the eyes of someone who had already seen too much. Celeste was brilliant. That much was obvious. Her essays read like they belonged to someone twice her age, metaphors layered on metaphors, imagery so vivid it stayed lodged in my head for days after grading them. But she also terrified me, though I never admitted it to anyone. She had a way of watching me during class, her head tilted just slightly, lips parted like she wanted to speak, yet never did. And when I finally called on her, she would whisper her answers so softly I often couldn't hear. Still, her words, they always cut deep, as though she had pried open the question and found something raw inside it. The other students avoided her. They weren't cruel, not exactly. They just didn't know what to do with her. Celeste lived in a world all her own, and none of them wanted to risk stepping inside. But I made the mistake of trying. I told myself I was being a good teacher, reaching out to a lonely student. But the truth? I think part of me was drawn to her. Not in the way people might assume, God, no. But in the way you can't help staring at a flickering light bulb, even though you know it might burn out at any second. And then came the letter. It was after class one evening. She lingered at her desk long after the others had gone, slowly packing her bag as if each movement required calculation. I remember asking if she was all right. She just stared at me, those eyes unblinking. Then she said, "Do you ever feel like your thoughts don't belong to you?" The question chilled me. I laughed awkwardly, muttering something about stress and overthinking. But she didn't move, didn't break eye contact. And before I could say anything else, she whispered, "They get louder when I write them down." I don't know why that struck me so deeply. Maybe because I knew what she meant. I'd kept journals since I was young, and there were times the words I scribbled scared me, as if they hadn't come from me at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words circled in my mind. They get louder when I write them down. So I wrote her a letter. A ridiculous, reckless idea. I told myself it was just a gesture of kindness, something to show her she wasn't alone. The letter was long, rambling, part advice, part confession. I told her the things I was too afraid to say aloud, that writing can be dangerous, yes, but it can also be power. That when thoughts grow too loud, sometimes the only way to silence them is to let them live outside your head, on paper. I also wrote things I regret. Things that didn't sound like me at all. Lines that poured out so quickly I barely remember writing them. Lines like, ink is a doorway, and once you open it, something else might come through. Where had that come from? I don't know. But when I reread the letter, those words sent a shiver down my spine. I almost tore it up. Almost. But I didn't. The next day, I slipped the envelope into her hand. Her fingers were ice cold. She looked at me, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw a smile. Not warm, not grateful, but knowing. Like she had been waiting for this. That was the last normal day of my life. Because after Celeste read that letter, everything began to change. After I gave Celeste the letter, I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. Just words. Just ink. A simple attempt at kindness that would probably be forgotten the next day. But it wasn't forgotten. Not by her. The very next morning, she arrived before anyone else. I noticed because I was still arranging papers at my desk when the door opened and her figure slipped inside. Her movements were quieter than the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She didn't look at me. She just sat down, set her bag on the floor, and began writing furiously in a notebook. Her pen didn't stop moving until the bell rang. When class ended, I saw it again, the same notebook clutched tightly to her chest as she slipped out the door. From that day on, it became routine. Celeste would arrive early, sometimes long before I even unlocked the classroom. Once, I found her standing outside in the gray morning fog, her eyes fixed on the locked door as though she had been waiting for hours. Always, she was writing. Her notebooks multiplied. Spiral-bound journals stacked in her bag, the edges frayed, the pages ink-stained to the point of bleeding through. I should have been relieved. At first, I told myself maybe the letter had helped. Maybe she was finally finding an outlet. But something in the way she wrote unsettled me. There was no pause, no reflection. The truth is, by then, I had already started hearing things. At night, when my apartment was silent, I'd hear faint scratching. Not from the walls or ceiling, but from the desk where I kept my own journals. Sometimes, it was the sound of pages flipping. Other times, it was the squeak of a pen dragging itself across paper, though when I looked, the notebooks were always closed, untouched. The first time it happened, I laughed it off. "You're imagining it," I whispered to myself, though my voice trembled. But then the dreams began. Dreams of Celeste, sitting in the back of my classroom, her notebook open. Only in the dream, I couldn't see what she was writing. I'd try to approach her, but no matter how many steps I took, her desk remained the same distance away. And then she'd stop, lift her head, and stare at me. Her eyes would darken, the pupils swallowing the color until her gaze was nothing but black voids. That's when I'd wake up, drenched in sweat. Every night, the dream repeated. Every night, those eyes. It was around this time that I started noticing her effect on the other students. They whispered about her in the hallways. I'd catch fragments of gossip. "She doesn't blink, she hums in class. I swear I saw her in the parking lot at 3 a.m. None of them sat near her anymore. The desks around hers emptied, leaving her isolated, as though some invisible boundary surrounded her. Even the bravest kids avoided crossing it. And then came the incident. I was erasing the board after class when I heard a muffled sound. Turning, I saw one of the students, a boy named Marcus, standing stiffly by Celeste's desk. His hand clutched one of her notebooks. "Don't," I said automatically, but it was too late. Marcus flipped the cover open. For a moment, he just stared. His lips parted, but no words came. Then, without warning, he screamed. Not a shout, not a yelp, a full-throated, animalistic scream that made every hair on my arms rise. He dropped the notebook as if it burned him and bolted out the door. Celeste didn't move. She just picked up the notebook, closed it carefully, and slid it back into her bag. When her gaze met mine, my throat went dry. There was no anger in her expression. No shame. Only calm, patient certainty. Like she had expected this all along. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus had seen. The next day, I tried asking him, gently, if he was all right. He just shook his head violently. His eyes darted around the hallway like he was afraid someone would overhear. Then he whispered. It wasn't words. It was pictures. but not drawings. They moved. They were... He broke off, shuddering, and refused to speak again. I never pressed him, but I started to notice something else. Celeste's notebooks weren't just multiplying. They were spreading. I began finding scraps of paper tucked into textbooks, wedged beneath desks, even slipped into my own bag. Always filled with strange, broken sentences. Ink remembers what the mouth forgets. She told me you would help. Don't let him sing it. That last one made my skin crawl, though at the time I had no idea what it meant. Only later, when his songs began echoing words I recognized, would it all come crashing together. One afternoon, as the last leaves of autumn skittered across the parking lot, I stayed late to grade essays. The classroom was empty, silent except for the scratching of my red pen. That's when I noticed a faint humming. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the corner. Celeste sat there, her eyes fixed on me. I hadn't even realized she was still in the room. Her lips were barely moving, yet the sound filled the air, a low, haunting melody. I didn't recognize the tune, but something about it made my bones ache. "Celeste," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's late. You should go home." The humming stopped. Slowly, she closed her notebook. Then she said, very softly, almost tenderly, "You shouldn't have written it down." Before I could respond, she rose and walked out, leaving me alone with the echo of her words. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just dealing with a troubled student anymore. Something else had taken root in her. And somehow, I had helped it grow. I've avoided telling you exactly what I wrote in that letter. Even now, years later, I hesitate. Because the truth is, I don't remember writing all of it. Some lines are burned into my mind, yes. The ones that still keep me awake. But others, when I look back at the copy I kept for myself, I swear my own handwriting feels like that of a stranger. Yes, I kept a copy. Why? I don't know. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe some part of me already sensed I'd regret it, and I wanted a record. The letter began innocently enough. "Celeste, I know you feel like your thoughts don't belong to you. I felt that too. Writing helps. It pulls the shadows out of your head and onto the page. Once they're on paper, they can't hurt you the same way." I remember feeling proud of that. Encouraging. Teacherly. But then the tone changed. "But be careful. Words are hungry things. They don't just sit still, they move, they crawl. Once you write them, they start looking for ways to live." I don't remember writing that sentence. Ink is a doorway, and once you open it, something else might come through. If your hand trembles, if you feel the pen pulling you, stop. Not every voice belongs to you. That line, "Not every voice belongs to you," still makes me shiver. Because I didn't believe it when I wrote it. I don't even think it was my thought. The letter ended like this. "If you ever feel afraid of what you've written, don't tear it up. That never works. Burn it. Fire is the only language ink respects." When I reread that now, my blood runs cold. Because in all the years I've taught, in all the years I've written, I never once believed in anything superstitious. I didn't believe in cursed words. But somehow, those warnings flowed out of me, and instead of stopping, I delivered them into the hands of a girl who was already drowning in voices. And Celeste believed every word. It started subtly. A shift in her posture, her voice. Before the letter, she had been quiet, timid. But afterward, there was a new confidence in her. A sharpness. One morning, she raised her hand during discussion. That alone shocked me. She never volunteered. When I called on her, she stood, notebook in hand, and began to read. At first, it sounded like poetry. Strange, broken lines about shadows and glass and rivers of ink. But as she read, her voice deepened, almost doubled, like something was speaking through her. The other students shifted uneasily. One girl began crying silently. When Celeste finished, the room was dead silent. She closed her notebook, smiled faintly, and sat back down as if nothing had happened. I tried to brush it off as performance. Teenagers experiment with dramatic flair all the time. But inside, I was trembling, because I recognized fragments of my own letter woven into her words. The changes grew more unsettling with each passing day. She stopped carrying normal supplies. No textbooks, no folders. Only notebooks, dozens of them, stacked high in her bag. I caught glimpses of her writing, endless passages of looping, cryptic language. Sometimes the ink smeared into patterns that almost looked like faces. Her handwriting itself began to shift. Where once it had been elegant, now it was jagged, erratic, almost painful to look at. Some pages were so dense with black ink they looked like they'd been drenched in tar. And then there were her eyes. The glassy stillness I had first noticed was gone. Now, when she looked at me, there was fire. Too much fire. Like her body was a shell barely containing something larger, hungrier. The first undeniable sign came 2 weeks later. I was collecting assignments when I realized Celeste hadn't turned anything in. I approached her desk cautiously. "Celeste," I said softly, "do you have your essay?" She looked up slowly. Her lips curved in a smile that wasn't hers. "I wrote it last night," she whispered. "But the paper caught fire." I blinked. "It caught fire?" She nodded, calm, as if describing a routine accident. "I didn't burn it. It burned itself. You said that could happen." Her words pierced me like ice. "I never said." But then I stopped. I had. In the letter, I'd told her fire was the only way to silence ink. And now, she was claiming her own writing had ignited on its own. Her eyes held mine, unblinking. It screamed while it burned. A chill swept over me. The classroom suddenly felt airless. I wanted to dismiss it as teenage melodrama, but something deep inside told me she wasn't lying. That night, I took out my copy of the letter. For the first time since writing it, I read it by candlelight. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to face it in the same atmosphere she must have. The candle flickered as my eyes moved across the page. And when I reached the final line, "Fire is the only language ink respects," the flame guttered. Just for a moment, but long enough to plunge me into darkness before reigniting. That was when I decided I had to retrieve the letter I gave her. Destroy it before it did more damage. But by then, it was too late. The next day, Celeste was gone. She hadn't shown up for any of her classes. When I asked the administration, they told me her parents had called her in sick. But something in their voices, tight, rehearsed, made me suspect otherwise. For 3 days, she didn't return. I tried to put her out of my mind, but the nights grew worse. The dreams more vivid. In one, I was back in the classroom. The desks were empty except for hers. She sat with her notebook open, pen moving rapidly. When I tried to approach, she looked up. But it wasn't Celeste anymore. Her face had stretched, eyes black pits, mouth a jagged tear from ear to ear. When she spoke, her voice was layered, hundreds of voices tangled together. "You gave me the key." I woke gasping, clawing at my chest. My sheets were damp with sweat, and on my nightstand sat one of my journals, open, though I hadn't touched it. Across the page, in my own handwriting, was a single line I didn't remember writing. "She is not sick. She is listening." On the 4th day, Celeste returned. When she walked into class, every head turned. Something about her presence was different. The air itself felt charged, like static before a lightning strike. She was smiling. Not shyly, not awkwardly, but broadly, confidently, almost radiantly. Her notebooks were stacked higher than ever, her fingers stained black with ink. And when she sat down, she began humming again. This time, I recognized the melody. It was the same tune I'd heard in my dreams. And though I didn't know it then, it was also the same melody that would later echo in the lyrics of a rising artist, the same words that would spread across millions of ears, carrying Celeste's curse far beyond the walls of my classroom. The same voice, hiding in his songs. The same voice. When Celeste returned after those missing days, something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the quiet, fragile girl who scribbled in notebooks to keep her demons at bay. She was the demon now. Or rather, she was the vessel. Every time she entered the room, a heaviness settled over the class. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pens froze over paper. The other students wouldn't even look at her anymore. They pretended she didn't exist, the way children pretend not to see something in the corner of their bedroom at night. But I saw her. And worse, she saw me. She started humming constantly. A low, steady tune that wormed its way into my skull until I caught myself humming it under my breath at home, unaware until I stopped in terror. One evening, I turned on the radio while driving, desperate to drown out the sound echoing in my head. Static filled the speakers, then a faint melody drifted through. The same melody. The DJ's voice crackled cheerfully. That was a new track by D4vd, an artist to watch out for. His sound is spreading fast. My blood ran cold. The words, the notes, they weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the world. On the radio. Soon to be everywhere. And I knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that Celeste was responsible. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Music borrows from everywhere, right? Maybe the melody just sounded familiar. But then, one night, I made the mistake of searching D4vd's lyrics online. The first song I clicked contained a line that froze me in place. Ink remembers what the mouth forgets. Those were my words. My exact words. From the scraps I'd found stuffed into desks, from the letter I had given her. I slammed the laptop shut, heart pounding. It wasn't possible. How could a rising artist have access to phrases Celeste had written? Unless she was feeding them to him. The haunting signs intensified. My journals began filling with lines I hadn't written. At first, I thought maybe I'd been sleepwalking, scribbling unconsciously. But the handwriting wasn't mine anymore. The letters twisted, sharp, jagged, more like claw marks than pen strokes. One morning, I woke to find a phrase scrawled across the mirror in my bathroom. Don't let him sing it. The words were written in black ink. My pens lay untouched on the counter. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Celeste, with her notebooks open, her face lit by some unnatural glow as she wrote, and wrote, and wrote. And behind her, always just out of sight, I felt the presence of something watching through her. I tried to warn the administration. I told them Celeste needed help, that something was wrong. They dismissed me, muttering about stress, burnout, paranoia. I even considered calling her parents. But every time I picked up the phone, the line went dead before I could dial. Not static, just silence, like the receiver had been swallowed whole. And then the whispers began. Not hers. Mine. I'd be in the middle of grading when I'd hear my own voice, my exact voice, speaking from somewhere behind me. When I turned, the room was empty. The whispers always said the same thing. You gave her the key. Now you must listen. It wasn't just me anymore. One afternoon, during a group project, a student named Danielle suddenly dropped her pencil and clutched her ears. Make it stop, she sobbed. Please, make it stop. I rushed to her, panicked. What? What's wrong? The song, she gasped. It's inside my head. I glanced toward Celeste. She sat calmly in the corner, humming. The same melody. Always the same. That night, I checked online again. D4vd's new single had just dropped. It was already climbing charts. And in the chorus, the same melody Celeste hummed day after day. My stomach turned. This wasn't coincidence. It was transmission. Somehow, through her notebooks, through me, through whatever had taken hold of her, the words and melodies were escaping. And now, they were feeding on the world. The final straw came when I found one of Celeste's notebooks in my own apartment. I hadn't taken it. I never would have dared. But there it was, sitting neatly on my nightstand, as though placed there while I slept. The cover was soft black leather, worn smooth by her hands. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The first page contained only one sentence, written over and over until the paper tore. He rises when they listen. The next pages were worse. Drawings, crude and frantic, of a faceless figure with hands stretched wide, mouth gaping. In some sketches, the mouth spilled ink like a fountain. In others, it stretched so wide it split the face apart. And beneath every drawing, one word repeated. Sing. I slammed the notebook shut and hurled it across the room. But when I turned back moments later, it was gone. The next day, Celeste wasn't in class. Nor the next. The school said she'd moved away. Transferred suddenly, without warning. But I knew the truth. She hadn't left. Not really. She had passed the voice along. And now, every time I hear his music, every time another D4vd track plays and millions sing along, I hear her. I hear them. The words I should never have written. The door I should never have opened. Celeste may be gone, but the letter remains. Not in my drawer, not in her hands, but alive, in every lyric, every melody, every voice that carries her curse forward. And the worst part? I still catch myself humming along. That was when I understood the haunting wasn't confined to me anymore. It had gone global. And soon, no one would be able to escape it. After the notebook appeared on my nightstand and then vanished, I realized I could no longer be passive. Sitting in my apartment, surrounded by my own journals, I felt like a man who had accidentally dropped a match into a dry forest. The flames were no longer mine to smother. They had appetite, and they were moving fast. I started to dig. At first it was small things, old student files, yearbooks, district emails. I asked around casually, former teachers, the guidance counselor, anyone who might remember Celeste before she stepped into my class. Most of the people I asked smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. Others shrugged. She'd been quiet, had attendance issues, moved around a lot. Nobody would speak plainly about what they'd seen. I realized, painfully, that the adults were practicing a kind of denial I had not expected. If they didn't describe the thing, it couldn't exist. Denial buys time. It also leaves traces. One evening in the school library, scanning brittle newspapers and old municipal archives, I found a grain of continuity, a tiny blurb from the summer a decade earlier about a house fire that began in a girl's room after an unexplained ignition. The story had been buried under the local oddities column, but the details were chilling. Notebooks found half-charred, words scorched perfectly clean in the margins, a single, neat spiral-bound book missing from the pile and never recovered. The name attached to that fire was different, but the pattern matched. Notebooks, spontaneous combustion, claims that the victim had been listening. My stomach went cold. This was not a single, isolated incident. It was a recurrence. I started tracing the language. Ink remembers what the mouth forgets. Don't let him sing it. He rises when they listen. Those phrases, the way they looped and reappeared in scrap paper and lyrics, felt less like random lines and more like a map. Not geographical, a pattern that connected people across time who had written, or been written for, and then, changed. That realization pushed me to corners I had never intended to visit. Late nights in dim bookstores led to tattered pamphlets on folklore. I read about ink as a metaphor for memory, about Victorian practices of keeping counterscripts, about marginalia that captured unwilled thought. It was academic and safe, until it wasn't. In an obscure occultography, written in dense, academic language but stitched with the same phrases I'd been seeing, was a description of a phenomenon that matched too closely to ignore. I'm not going to repeat the instructions here. I won't spell out the steps, and I won't give power to whatever force these pages hinted at. But the pamphlet described ink as a conduit. Words laid down in fervor become attractors, and songs, certain cadences, act as amplifiers. It said, in an oblique, clinical sentence, that voices can be carried by melody in a way they cannot by page alone. The weight of that sentence hit me so hard I nearly toppled the chair. If melody amplifies, then a song sung by millions is not just a song. It is a broadcast tower. Celeste's notebooks, once private, had become a transmitter. Someone, something, had found a way to write it into other people. That someone learned to speak through lyrics that matched the cadence her writing seemed to favor. Why D4vd? I still don't know if he understood. I tried to trace the timeline, Celeste's humming, the melody's appearance on the radio, the lyrics surfing across streaming platforms. Viral music grows for many reasons: algorithmic luck, catchy hooks, a push from the right playlist, but the coincidence of timing felt like more than chance. It was as if a previously confined signal had found a carrier, and the carrier happened to be a human voice with reach. Whether that voice was complicit or merely convenient, it didn't matter to the person in my hallways who dropped a notebook as if it had burned her hands. The infection spread either way. I kept finding more victims. Not always girls named Celeste. Different towns, different years, but with the same strange residue: notebooks, midnight humming, words appearing scraped into surfaces. In one case, a teacher in another district had received a note tucked into a returned essay: "You kept the key." He turned pale when I showed him my copy of the original letter. He would not, in the end, speak much. He left teaching. A janitor in an elementary school told me, in a voice like paper, that he had found songs scrawled across the back pages of picture books. A young woman in a different state had posted at 3 a.m. that her roommate woke singing a tune they had never heard before, but the melody had a shape she recognized from a childhood rhyme. The pattern formed a lattice of whispers. I also learned, painfully, that burning didn't solve it. People had tried. Whole stacks of notebooks, lit in metal barrels, had produced blackened ash that smelled of something not quite like paper: acrid, metallic, and with a faint, sweet undertone that no fire supply store ever explained. The survivors told stories of the ash forming patterns in the wind like letters that cooled and remained, refusing to be scattered. One woman swore that when she set pages alight, a voice came from the flames, low and delighted, calling her name. I wanted to believe these accounts were delusions, but the similarity of detail made skepticism feel stupidly optimistic. At home, my own journals continued to betray me. Sentences appeared written by hands that were not mine. Not the style of anyone I could name, but the same jagged stroke that marked Celeste's later pages. I learned to read those pages the way one reads weather patterns, not with certainty, but with the uneasy knowledge that if you ignore them, a storm might catch you unawares. There came a day when I found a recording. It had been left in my mailbox, the kind of small, unlabeled thumb drive you find in thrift shops. For reasons I don't understand, I plugged it into an old laptop and pressed play. The audio was 2 tracks layered imperfectly: a low, humming melody, the one that had warmed into my dreams, and another sound beneath it, like pages being turned quickly, pages turning in a panic. Interposed were fragments of speech, my own voice and others, clipped and overlapping. Buried in the static was a phrase I had never expected to hear outside my head: "She's listening." It looped, softer each time, until the words were a background stain. When it ended, the room felt colder. I tried to destroy the drive, but the edge of it slipped and nicked my finger. The small cup bled an ink-colored droplet onto the plastic. I'd never been so afraid of my own skin. At the bottom of one testimony was a line that arrested me with its simplicity: "If you wrote to her, you are the echo." I read it again and again. I, who had thought myself the giver of counsel, was now complicit. In trying to do something small, to shepherd a troubled student toward the ink as medicine, I had given the thing its shape. My words were the first echo. Her notebooks multiplied that echo until it hummed loud enough to leave the page. What did one do with a guilt like that? Where does responsibility live when the language used became a key? I kept digging because the alternative was to sit empty-handed while the melody climbed the charts and reached more ears. The more pieces I found, the clearer a terrifying truth became. Whatever had taken root in people who wrote like Celeste needed voices. It ate attention. It needed listeners. And in a world that devoured music and shared it like holy bread, it had found a banquet. I learned one last thing in that stack of testimonies, and it is what pushed me into the dark certainty I live with now. The papers didn't say a simple cure. They didn't offer a silver bullet. What they did suggest, again and again, was that the only thing that severed the thread was attention turned away. Not destruction, not argument, not public exposure, denial. The very mechanism the adults practiced. That, of course, posed a moral paradox. The people who could stop it often chose not to see. And those who did see, like me, were left scapegoat-sized, forced into a terrible choice: speak and feed the thing with attention, or stay silent and watch it spread. I couldn't choose silence. I had written the first line. So I kept searching, making a record, naming the pattern, watching the charts climb and feeling the hum under my skin. Each discovery tightened the rope around my chest. Each notebook I opened answered with the same phrase, sometimes scrawled, sometimes whispered: "You gave her the key."